Okay, welcome to the screening recording on Streetcar and Tragedy, and this is take 2. I'm going to be covering different elements of tragedy and looking at different critical responses to A Streetcar Named Desire. And the theme of the lesson is it a tragedy? And would we call Blanche a tragic heroine or not? There's a lot of debate about this. I'm very biased. I find it a beautiful tragedy. But there are many critics with legitimate views who do not really believe that the play reaches tragic status. First of all, just very quickly, a little trip into history. Obviously, the genre of tragedy goes back to ancient Greece. And one of the things that Arthur Miller attacks, as you know, in particular, is this idea that tragedy is timeless. What a lot of modern playwrights say is that tragedy has to evolve with the times, doesn't it? And a number of things in particular that Arthur Miller points out, that Greek tragedy is thousands of years old. It was written in a slave society, and it was also written in a very patriarchal society in which female figures, when they do have power, are usually villains. Let's not forget, original tragedy, everyone wore masks, and there was a chorus, which is really interesting. And at the end of the term tragedy actually comes from goat song, doesn't it? So there's a dance, and it would have been a very different genre from what we understand today. The original tragedy that is used by Aristotle, as you guys know, is Oedipus Rex. You can all remember this, can't you? And Aristotle uses this as a kind of template for tragedy. I think it's really important to remind yourself that critics often try to take that model and they try to put it onto 20th century plays. And what I want you to do in this class is to actually think, where is Aristotle useful for me? And where is the 3,000-year-old Greeks thinking not really appropriate for our more modern conceptions of tragedy? So earlier, Dia was asking me about catharsis, and I think there are a few really key things that I want to cover in my slide on Aristotle. Okay, Aristotle says that the aim of tragedy is catharsis, so that it's going to arouse sensations of pity and fear. It's going to make us feel terrified. It's going to build all this tension in us. And then the catharsis comes with the death, when we have this kind of purging of the emotion. So Aristotle uses a kind of psychological explanation of tragedy, and he says that it basically cleanses us of all of our excess emotions, and it uplifts us and gives us a new heightened understanding of the world. I'm going to suggest modern tragedy doesn't give us such a new understanding of the world. In fact, modern tragedy often gives us what we could call more of a nihilistic view of the world, in which people seem to be punished for no reason at all. And maybe catharsis in modern tragedies becomes far more problematic. So some of the key vocabulary, just to remind you, is catharsis, which we've discussed, this catastrophe, or the tragic end, the terrible thing that happens in the play. In our own play, Streetcar, that of course is the rape in scene 10, although I know many of you would argue that the real catastrophe happens before our tragic action actually begins, with the suicide of Alan Gray. Don't forget that it's very important to talk about anagnoresis, which is this kind of realization that you've done everything wrong. Again, in Streetcar, we do not have this realization, do we? Blanche doesn't have the Othello moment, when Othello realizes that he's been played by Iago, etc. In fact, she leaves in a state of delusion. So one of the things you need to work out in your assessment of the play is, does it matter that there's no anagnoresis? Or does that particular Aristotelian concept not really apply to our modern conceptions of tragedy? Peripeteia, this reversal, is kind of quite an interesting idea, because Blanche's life is pretty much wrecked by the time she arrives. But we do know, don't we, in scene 6, that there's this kind of moment of light when she finds God in Mitchell's arms. And then after that, of course, Tennessee Williams will wreck her and destroy her, following that kind of tragic arc. There's always a heavy emphasis on fate and betrayal. And Aristotle talks about the hamartia, which is this idea of missing the mark, of bad judgment, or even of a moral flaw. Don't forget, Aristotle insists that the protagonist has to be noble and respected. So the whole Greek idea of tragedy was that it had to shake the world, didn't it? And many of the Greek tragic heroes would offend the gods. So there was this concept of hubris. Now, I think we can actually apply that to Blanche, even though her position's not elevated, like Oedipus Rex, or one of the great Greek tragedies. She still shows hubris, doesn't she? She shows arrogance, doesn't she? And we see that in her treatment, in particular, of Stanley, as though he's some kind of ape-like animal. And she looks at him like an anthropologist, doesn't she? Moving on. I'm going to be thinking about how does Streetcar differ now from elements that we would expect in classical tragedy, and there will be many of them. Okay. Now, one of the great influences on Tennessee Williams was the Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen, and the great female tragic character is called Hedda Gabler. Some of you may know this play or may have heard about her. Now, Hedda has been called the female Hamlet because it is the holy grail role that actresses want to play. Now, what happens in Hedda Gabler is that Ibsen is taking a much more everyday, normal, naturalistic setting. So you see, Ibsen was one of the key people who reconfigures tragedy so that it doesn't have to take place in like a king's court or something like that. It can take place in an ordinary bourgeois home. So this is the movement in modern tragedy away from the idea that it has to shake the world and be of great significance. We know that Streetcar takes place in a shabby apartment. We know that it's not great seismic people who are going to make the United States shudder. But I do think that it does still have a very big, wider kind of significance that I'm going to go into. Now, as Arthur Miller says in his paper, Tragedy and the Common Man, that it is crazy for American playwrights in a democratic society in the 20th century to be told that their characters can't be tragic. And Miller was really offended by this. He wrote this essay in response to his brilliant play, Death of a Salesman. And those of you who know this play, it'd be a good play to know a little bit about, to bring it into essays. In this, Willy Loman is a salesman who, like Blanche, is really deluded. He is absolutely determined to see himself as an incorporation of the American dream, but actually his life is a failure. He's a failure as a salesman, he's a failure as a father, and he's a failure as a husband. And in the end, I'll spoil it for you, he kills himself. Now, many critics were very hostile to the play and said, how the hell is this a tragedy? This is just a story of a stupid salesman who's completely deluded. And what Arthur Miller does in this essay, and I think you should read it, is he really goes after these critics and he explains why you cannot use an Aristotelian lens in a 20th century American democratic context. Moving on. So just to remind you of some of the themes, these are not the only ones, but these are some of the things for you to think about. Sexuality and desire, men versus women, poetic versus real, masculinity versus femininity, survival of the fittest versus, I suppose, degeneration, transgression of love and passion, class antagonism, a battle between, say, culture and the physical world, hierarchy versus democracy, we could say white versus mixed blood, loyalty versus treachery. Now, one of the things I'll say is I've deliberately put these binaries against each other, but this is a very important point for your exam, so listen very carefully to my clue. Some of the things that seem like binaries are not really binaries, are they not? Let's think about Blanche for a minute. She would like to represent herself as culture and art, and she would like to represent Stanley as body and appetite. But is that in fact true, guys? Of course not. So quite often, what Williams does is he shows us that the way people present themselves is very far from the reality. That's something I think he learned from Ibsen, who really likes to show, here's the way people want to present themselves in the living room, and here's what's happening in the bedroom, if you get what I mean. And we do get that with Blanche, don't we? We do get the way that she presents herself is in fact artificial and false in many ways. And that kind of hypocrisy, that mendacity, that fakeness of Blanche is something you're going to have to contend with in your analysis. You're going to have to say, given this falsity, etc., can you still find her tragic? If so, how does the audience forgive her? And how do we overcome our kind of reservations that we might have about her? Okay, one more thing here is to just remind you that in Aristotelian tragedy, the female protagonists were often just seen as transgressively evil. And that's because female power in the classical world was seen as kind of weird and transgressive. And those female characters often get punished. However, in modern tragedy, what they tend to do, and Ibsen does this both in Hedda Gabler and The Doll's House, is he shows that women are often trapped in roles that do not allow them to express themselves, that confine them to very narrow strictures and behavior codes. Okay? Now, moving on, I said that I was going to talk a little bit about Hegel. It's unfortunate that my screen is not mirroring now, but you've got the slide, I hope, in front of you, the Hegel slide, and I want you to listen really carefully, because again, this is a big clue for you, okay? Williams viewed Blanche's struggle as inherently tragic, and in his production notes, he describes Blanche as someone who cannot face the brute force of reality without turning to illusion. Later, in an interview in 1951, he said, Blanche was a victim of a culture that no longer existed, aligning her fall with the tragic demise of a way of life. Now, this is really important. Think in the play about Edgar Allan Poe. Think in the play of the epigraph, which is Hart Crane, The Broken Tower. Think of Robert Browning, and we have all of this imagery of death and decline. And I would say Poe, of those people, is probably the most important, because his stories are all of aristocratic decline. Why would those stories resonate with a Southern writer like Tennessee Williams? Well, because Tennessee Williams really felt that decline of the South. So one of the things that I would be looking for when you do your context, your AO1, is that you'd be integrating Blanche and the decline of the South together. So that if people argue this is just the story of a loose woman in an apartment who drinks too much and has slightly pedophilic tendencies, you would argue, no, it's much more complex than that. It has this wider kind of cultural resonance of the decline of the South, etc. And I do think that Blanche and Stanley do represent a clash between cultures and times, don't they? And when we remember Hegel, do you remember what Hegel said? That history is driven by the clash of forces. He calls that thesis and antithesis. Do you remember that? And he says that moves history forward. And what happens when you are part of the past? You get ground down and crushed. So why would tragedy be so effective? Because the audience see and they can empathize with the personification of the past, and they see how brutal time is, and they see how ruthlessly people who are on the wrong side of history are broken. Now, do you see that that's a very different view from Aristotle? Aristotle personalized it a lot more, didn't he? The term hamartia makes the protagonists partially at least responsible for their tragic downfall. Hegel puts much more emphasis on the smashing of the individual by history, large forces that are beyond their control. I think that's a very, very good way of looking at A Streetcar Named Desire. Do you guys think so? Do you see that? So that's a lens that you could think about using. And I've called the slide The Eclipse of a World because in his book Modern Tragedy, Raymond Williams, who's a very famous British critic, argues that modern tragedy emerges not from individual moral failings, but from history, from these conflicts in history. So Williams is taking more of a Hegelian lens there on. And don't forget that, so Blanche's tragedy for Williams then is the collapse of the Old South and its values by an industrialized male society in which her values have no place. So she'll be broken and eclipsed by history. So there are some very significant things to talk about in terms of symbolic meanings, okay? Obviously in Greek tragedy you had costumes and masks, etc. But in ours, we do actually have some very significant props, don't we? We have the cemeteries and we have desire, don't we? So the train line kind of represents, doesn't it, these two poles. The fact that the play is set in Elysian Fields would suggest that Blanche has already entered a kind of death world, hasn't she? And she's in the final throes of death as she struggles with Stanley. Let's not forget we've got the flowers for the dead lady outside, who seems to us to be real. But don't forget, one of the things to write about in this play is that it's plastic theatre, and we experience the play through Blanche, don't we? She's our focalizer, and Williams allows us to live in Blanche's mind, to feel her suffering and her confusion, etc. Clothes are very important with Blanche, aren't they? Particularly colours. And that, of course, links to bathing, to feelings of dirt, etc. We know that when she gets raped, just before she gets raped, she was wearing red, wasn't she? And then when she comes out at the end of the play, she's not wearing white that time, but she's wearing de la Robière blue. Do you remember this? And that is the colour of the Madonna paintings in the Renaissance. It's a special blue palette, and it was only used for Mary, Jesus' mother, the Madonna, and you can see that Blanche seems to be trying to, grasp at this idea of overcoming all the filth and physicality that she feels polluted by. So plastic theatre must be in your essay, no matter what the title is. You get it in there because it's such an enormous part of it, isn't it? We know that elements of plastic theatre include music, lighting, stage design, the transparency of the walls, etc., the use of shadows, the breaking down of the fourth wall, the breaking down of the inside-outside dichotomy, the fact at any stage you can bring the streets into the apartment, can't you? Yeah? The Vesuviana is heard at key moments. Initially, we don't understand it. Last time we looked at scene 6 in quite a lot of detail, didn't we? And after scene 6 and Blanche's tale of the terrible death of Alan Gray, we begin to understand the significance of the polka. Don't forget that the polka is a happy music, isn't it? So just think about how irksome and weird it is that you've got this kind of oompa music in the background happening. It's a kind of carousel, merry-go-round music. I think it's very effective at capturing insanity. And we know that it moves from the minor to the major key more and more as we get to the end to show the depth of her confusion. That goes together with, things like jungle noises and locomotives and shining lights, etc. They show the degree of Blanche's distress. I think that they're key to the tragedy, don't you guys? What Tennessee Williams is doing is he's using all of his powers as an avant-garde playwright to show the suffering and to take us inside his character's mind. Shakespeare, guys, used the soliloquy, didn't he? And the amazing thing about Othello, when you write about Othello, is that Iago gets more soliloquies than Othello. That's absolutely bizarre, because usually only the tragic hero gets the soliloquies, because we go into their mind. And that's something for you always to write about when you're thinking about Othello. Why is it Shakespeare gives Iago more soliloquies than Othello. Kind of weird, isn't it? Yeah. I also want you to remember Malziner, who is the original designer. He pioneered this kind of gauze wall. Do you remember this? That can go either opaque or translucent. So at any stage, they can light up that apartment and they can bring the outside world in. Now, we have all of this cultural and racial stuff in the play that you need to write about. Right from the beginning with the infatuated brown fingers, which suggests the kind of sexual energy, what Nietzsche would call the Dionysian, the music, lust, physical side of life. And we know that that side of life absolutely terrifies Blanche, doesn't it? Yeah? So we have this amazing set design. We have the, what's it called again? The inn down the saloon down the road is called the Three Juices, is that right? The Three Juices and the Blue Moon cocktail and that constant music, the piano and the blues and the clarinets moaning and stuff like that. These are all words that are terrifying to Blanche. These are symbols that terrify, aren't they? They are black. They are sexual. They are the new America. Remember that New Orleans itself is culturally heterogeneous, isn't it? And it has this exciting new jazz music. And all of this basically speaks to Blanche and tells her that her world is over. It absolutely terrifies her. Remember the easy racial mixing that's going on? The fact that you've got people like Pablo and stuff like that. So you've got non-white people, you've got Latino people there, etc. All of this terrifies Blanche. What does she represent? That kind of hierarchical, older United States, where you knew your place and everything was segregated and districted. So why does this relate to Malziner? Well, Malziner, at any stage, can use this brilliant set design to bring in that world. And then we go into Blanche's mind and we feel the fear of our tragic heroine. Now, I think this is also very interesting. 1961, a British literary critic and philosopher, George Steiner, wrote a book called The Death of Tragedy. You could talk about this. And what Steiner said is, you cannot have tragedy in the modern world. In fact, he said, you can't have tragedy after Auschwitz, where they killed the Jews in the death camp. And he said that's because people don't really have any real metaphysical beliefs anymore. People have talked about the death of God. And what Steiner's saying is, if you have the death of God, if you have the death of beliefs, you cannot have tragedy. It doesn't exist anymore. And he actually says, you don't have the grandeur of unredeemed suffering anymore. However, there are many critics such as Philip Colin and Mary Ann Corrigan who reject these attacks on Streetcar. Colin argues that Blanche lacks the moral stature of a tragic heroine. She says that she is too theatrical and self-destructive. So she's a good one to put into your essays, where she says, I don't find her remotely so. Now, I think Tennessee Williams was thinking about this whole idea of the death of tragedy, and I think both Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller were trying to write a new tragedy that would work within this time period. Yes, it would be very different, but it would still have this idea of the terrible, unjustifiable suffering of someone that we would find haunting. And I put it to you, class, that Blanche Dubois is still considered a very tragic character by many people, very memorable. She actually represents something, doesn't she, that goes way beyond what she is just as a person. Now, Arthur Miller had a debate with a critic called Coprince, okay? And what Arthur Miller says is that Blanche is a tragic figure. Her illusions may be false, but her attempt to maintain dignity mirrors Miller's vision of a common person tragedy. So do you remember at the end, when she's been taken out and she comes out with her beautiful line, I've always relied on the kindness of strangers. She kind of represents something much bigger than herself. She's given this beautiful, dignified exit, isn't she? And what Williams says about Blanche is, this is a quote, a delicate creature crushed under the heel of brutish realism. So what does Susan Copran say? She says, no, Blanche is not a tragic figure. She's more pitiful than tragic. That's a great quote, isn't it? She is pitiful, not tragic. The word pitiful actually has a kind of connotation of not really respecting that person. And what Copran says is that Blanche just retreats into fantasy. She never really actively confronts her fate. So if we look at someone like Othello, at least he tries to confront his fate, doesn't he? He tries to do something. He tries to master it. What Copran says, well, Blanche doesn't try to confront her fate. She just passively, allows herself to decline and to be taken away without resistance. Another critic called Annette Siddiq argued that her fragility is aestheticized rather than interrogated, that she's not a true object of pathos. Remember, pathos is a good word to use. We don't actually feel that sad for her because she's too melodramatic and she isn't self-critical and she doesn't have that anagnoresis, a word I always find very hard to say for some reason. And so we don't ever get that moment when she looks at herself and she sees her delusions, etc. So you have to ask yourself, guys, can you be a tragic hero if you don't have this moment of realization? Now, Stanley, I wanted to say a bit about him, okay? Because today Stanley is a villain. We know, don't we, that audiences at the time, particularly male audiences, quite liked Stanley. And many men saw his behavior as justified. In the age of Me Too, that's quite a difficult kind of view to accept. But don't forget, another very important piece of the context for you to remember is Stanley is a post-war figure. He's a working-class hero. He's a war veteran, and he's a war hero, isn't he? And I think the post-war context is very important for you to remember. Christian and I have talked about that GI Bill, haven't we? We've talked about the Sunbelt states and the growth of the new kind of wealthy, industrialized worker who has money to spend and who believes that his life is worth something. Now, pre-war, and this would have happened in Britain as well, pre-war people were much more accepting of class hierarchy. But Stanley is part of a new culture of class antagonism, isn't he? And he's trying to justify his position. Hence the reference to Huey Long. Do you guys remember that? The Labour leader, and the idea that Stanley says that he is a king in his own house. Yeah? So what's interesting about Stanley would be what is his kind of role in the tragedy. Well, you could see him as a villain, or you could see him as a kind of nemesis, or what I think William sees him is a kind of agent of history. What does he represent? A kind of modern, hard, masculine, new materialism that will ultimately destroy Branch. The thing about Stanley, though, is he emerges unchanged and unrepentant. He doesn't for a minute reflect on his conduct. So I do feel that he ends as a bit of a villain. And in the end, the last thing we see of him is he's trying to put his hand down his wife's blouse, isn't he? And use her physicality. He's trying to basically seduce her once again. Yeah. Now, I'm nearly finished. I just wanted to compare just quickly to Willy Loman in Death of a Salesman, because I think it is quite interesting for you for AO1 to know about the genre of this post-war American tragedy. And it is these two playwrights, Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams, who really define it. Blanche is less active and less self-aware and more emotionally unstable than Willy Loman. But they do share the fact that they're both undone by their personal illusions clashing with social reality. So you've got this idea of a fantasy world clashing with a hard, real world. The British director Peter Brook suggests that modern tragedy arises not from fate, but from economic, psychological, and society forces, okay? So that's kind of quite interesting because, once again, Peter Brook feels like the character is ground down by history and social changes, okay? So there's a big debate about Blanche, and I can't answer this question for you. You need to work out to what extent you see her as a kind of tragic hero or not. And I guess I'm going to end with that now. If you were to do a writing task, would be for you to think of this question. Blanche fails to attain tragic status in A Streetcar Named Desire. That's a very complex question. We've seen a whole variety of different views. I think if you're going to use the Hegelian lens, that Blanche represents a kind of part of history that's been ground down and killed, etc., that would help us rehabilitate Blanche and give her that tragic status.